Cyber. We're going to be taking a look at business and security in today's digital world. I'm Lou Covey. I'm your host. I'm a cyber journalist. I am the chief editor for Cyber Protection Magazine. I've been covering technology for a long time, but I've been focused primarily on cybersecurity for the past few years, and it's one of the most fascinating areas I've ever covered. And I've covered everything from ladies' shoes to nuclear weapons. Cybersecurity is a hot topic. It's in the news almost every day now. And yet, according to Microsoft, over 70% of businesses are not prepared for a cyber attack. And many of you, despite all of this knowledge about cybersecurity, you're turning the other way until something bad happens, at which point it's going to be too late. So most of us, in other words, are reactive to security rather than being proactive about it. And that's just not good enough. So today we brought together a bunch of really smart people to back off what I may not know. And we're trying to help you figure out what it is you need to do. And these are the people we've got with us today. We've got Bob Ackerman, who was the founder of Allegis Cybersecurity, Allegis, which is a cybersecurity investment company. And it's really the first one that there ever was. He was named Cyber's Money Man in 2015. He doesn't even know how he got that title. We have Evan Rice from GuideStar, Senior Vice President of Security Strategy, and they're interested in working in the financial sector and educating people around cybersecurity. Then we have First Pace, a cybersecurity practice leader at Brightline Insurance, and that's going to be a very important area to take a look at because insurance is kind of keeping everyone honest right now. And then we have Heather Spencer, an expert in passwordless multi-factor authentication for zero trust security with Tradeware. And he is, by the way, the CEO of Tradeware. So we're going to start off right now with Bob. Business doesn't operate without money. And Bob, you are the guy that helps put the money into the process, especially into the area of cybersecurity. And what I want to know from you is what's lacking in the cybersecurity industry today? What kind of companies are you looking to invest in that aren't being covered?
Well, I think, first of all, cyber represents sort of the existential threat to the global digital economy. So it's one of those areas where investment, whether it's on the part of the innovators or on the part of enterprises in their business, is really non-discretionary. You don't have a choice because, as you know, to your opening remarks, Lou, you will not avoid being a victim at some point in time. It is inevitable. The cyber threat landscape really represents digitization of the entire spectrum of bad human behavior, and eventually it will knock on your door. No two ways about it. I think as you look at the landscape today. First of all, I think we're in the very early innings of the evolution of the cyber threat landscape. And I think that equates to our responses today. Our responses are primarily reactive, a little bit of whack-a-mole. And, if we're going to get ahead of this, or at least have an opportunity to go toe-to-toe with the adversary, we're going to have to think about becoming more proactive and preventative and basically taking what I call sort of a data-centric approach to security. The metaphor I use many times is, what's the mouse after? The cheese. The mouse will find a way to the cheese, and you can put mouse traps, all along the way. The mouse will eventually navigate a way to the cheese. And so the adversary, in most cases, outside of industrial systems, is after data. And so it's good to secure your infrastructure, the pathways to that data, but we need to think about securing the data. Fundamentally, because that at the end of the day, that is where the value is, and that is what the adversary is after. So, we spend a lot of time thinking about data-centric security. We also spend a lot of time thinking about, the next set of adversarial threats, whether that's weaponized data, whether it's risks associated with migration from IPv4 to IPv6. We live in a very dynamic environment. The adversary is not static. The adversary wakes up every day looking for a way to compromise systems, processes to achieve whatever their malicious intent is. and they are just as capable as the defenders, sometimes more capable. They are less constrained and sometimes better motivated. So you've got a determined adversary out there. And if we continue to posture ourselves reactively, we will lose at the end of the day.
It's a great point, Bob, because I think we also, from an insurance side of the house, we're dealing in an environment where there is a marketplace for malicious actors to trade in their weapon craft. And then secondly, it's the only line of business where there is a active hostile threat that is learning and evolving how to attack better and more efficiently and share that with their peers. And so for us, it kind of sets the stage of, okay, we're in an environment where insurance companies are essentially basically one-to-many networks. They are an aggregated risk themselves because they are contractually on the hook to pay claims. And so that's why we have seen an increase in attacks even on insurance companies. And so kind of where that is coming into play is really fascinating because you're seeing the other end of that capital deployment and through learning on the claims side. And really what that is trying to do is drive best practices and behaviors. So things like, I think Evan can speak to this, is around really having that honest conversation of knowing your business. And so, Evan, what does that kind of look like in your mind around, the deployment on the ground?
Yeah. And Bob, your point on the cheese is totally correct, right? Why is there cyber threat? Because there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of information, competitive advantage, things to be stolen. And you're right that there's a little bit of whack-a-mole because every business is different. You've got a 3-person chamber of commerce in rural America versus a, 10,000 employee corporation, out of a giant metropolitan area. And what we find a lot with the small to medium businesses that we work with is that regionality has a big play in their kind of perception of risk. They live in a small community. They don't lock their door when they go to their kid's soccer game, and they don't realize when they hook their business up to the internet, they're in essentially a cyber war zone. And making people aware of that risk has been the hardest part. There's and as we go in, I love talking with folks like you guys because we get to have those high level theoretical conversations, and I'm going in and we're talking about basic blocking and tackling. Yeah. It's here's this, you're wide open on this. We've got to patch this before we talk about anything else that's,
and that quantifying piece is really interesting. And I'd love the kind of Heath and Bob's input here is that it really feels like there's kind of this gap in the understanding of the market of what data actually reflects in terms of an asset value or how to actually put that into numerical terms of, okay, we can understand that if our building burns down, that there's a business interruption risk there. We don't quite comprehend why we need cyber insurance because our MSP handles that, right? There's always kind of this idea that someone else handles it. I guess, Bob and Heath, how are y'all seeing, I guess, that culture shift?
Well, I think one of the things that people don't realize, right? There's one, ransomware attacks are pretty obvious. Actually, they're reasonably straightforward, to mitigate the risk associated with them. But what people are not thinking about is their dependence on their digital infrastructure and what happens if they lose that digital infrastructure or that digital infrastructure is compromised or heaven forbid the digital infrastructure is manipulated. I spent a lot of time with folks on the offensive side, and we talk a lot about the evolution of threats and particularly weaponized data. What happens if you can no longer trust the data that powers your systems and that you use to make decisions? You're shut down. And we don't really think kind of in that 3-dimensional digital space in terms of, we understand, digitization, it drives efficiency, it lowers costs, it allows us to make better, faster decisions. But what if we're denied that? And the consequences, regardless of the size of your business, can be absolutely catastrophic. The adversary, you were talking about a force. In cyber is the only space in technology where there is an active offense.
Right.
That wakes up every day creating new threats. And they understand the value of your digital assets in ways that you probably do not appreciate. They are extraordinarily good at figuring out ways to compromise, leverage, manipulate, to whether it's to steal, to hold you hostage, whatever it may be. They're incredibly clever. And then, as I said,
entirely different.
Exactly,
it's an entirely different arena of like risk modeling and even calculating that core fundamental risk. And I think that's where, from what we've seen, moving in the direction of like a passwordless MFA or making it easier for the clients to understand has really been helpful. And that, okay, you're kind of already familiar with that code popping up on your phone, but how can we make it feel like you don't necessarily have to interact with it and still provide that security layer? Because up until now, there really hasn't been that advisory piece from the insurance side. And even now we're seeing some of it, but I think it still kind of lacks that connection to the real world of how does the business actually interpret this as a risk based decision. And so that's where I think Heath has been really kind of fundamental in that. Looks like you're on mute, Heath.
If we go back to just the simple understanding of the cheese, right? And that a mice will always find the way to the cheese, right? The problem we have is we can't just lock the cheese away. It has to be accessible by the people that should be accessing it, right? There should be a certain mouse should be able to go get his cheese, right? And use that cheese how they see fit, the data, whatever it is. Otherwise, there's no way, otherwise you have to have accessibility, right? So how do we reduce the risk in authenticating, these people have the right to be there. These ones shouldn't be there. And how do you do that using technology in a way that reduces friction for the user, improves security in the process, automates some of those things so that, whether it's an application that needs to talk to another application or a device that needs to talk to something, in all of those scenarios, there's typically a human interaction somewhere. And that's been the weak point, right? And so how do we reduce the risk through technology in helping them understand, being proactive in these areas, kind of like the seatbelt in your car or the airbag in your car are actually proactive measures to reduce risk of something happening to you. You're still assuming risk when you drive your vehicle, but by doing those few things and the safety measures that have been built in, Forrest, you can speak to this, it's very quantifiable for whether you're writing a policy on a house or a business or a vehicle. If you do these things or you have a modern vehicle, your premium will be less, right? Because you've reduced the risk. We can quantify it that way. And this is where, Evan and his team that are really boots on the ground trying to help people understand that correlation between, you don't realize it, but when you drive a modern car, you're safer, right? So if you use modern technology the right way, you'll be safer. And then helping correlate that info.
Okay, I want to jump in. I want to jump in here before you go on that, Forrest. Just yesterday, I was on a Reddit string where some guy was saying his girlfriend got locked out of her account. Okay, so somebody guessed her password, got into the account, locked her out of it, and he admitted that she didn't use multi-factor authentication. And he just went on and on about this, and then he finally said, "It's LinkedIn's responsibility to keep these accounts safe." And I just about fell out of my chair because he admits that she does nothing to secure her account, but it's still LinkedIn's problem. And that's basically not understanding this basic security processes that we all have to go through. And yet we have companies or social media platforms that are saying, gee, all you need to do is turn on encryption and you'll be fine. Shouldn't that be on anyway? I mean, shouldn't there just be this process that says you must use multi-factor authentication, and tell them up front and give them explicit instructions on how to make sure that's done?
I think, Lou, you really ran into an important thing that we see a lot on the implementation side is there's multiple costs that relate to how you get something done, and money is one of them, but the other one is the capacity for change. And people don't like when products and tools that make them more secure are inconvenient. They don't want another step. They don't want to have to carry a thing. They don't want to have to remember a keyword or a passcode. And I mean, you want to see and I do this all the time. You want to see an organization get really angry, move them from an 8-character to a 14-character password.
Right.
Like you'll get 500 employees that are just irritated for a month. And there's so much kind of institutional, backlash from things like that. And I think that's what's great about the approach that Heath and the team at Tradeware is taking, is they're not only making it more secure by eliminating something that can get stolen, they're also making it easier. So there's a convenience factor where you're able to implement something that is more secure by default with a secure baseline per policy, but actually improve your employee and user experience while you're doing it. Huge takeaway, and why I'm excited about what Tradeware is doing and that move towards passwordless. And we have to get better as security people about understanding that we still ultimately are working with people, and that we have to see how people are impacted by what it is that we're doing and build solutions that recognize that, so we're not constantly just making their lives more inconvenient, even though what we're doing is keeping them safe.
Well, we all talk a lot about layered defense, and there's a lot to be said for layered defense. But with layered defense comes complexity, and complexity actually is the enemy of security. And so we have to get to a place from a design perspective. I think conceptually zero trust kind of moves us into that headspace of security is there by design, and frankly, it should be as transparent, and as just as invisible as we possibly can. There's also an interesting thing, Lou, when you talked about Reddit, there was a news piece that came out, I don't know, day before yesterday. It involved JP Morgan Chase. And there had been a JP Morgan Chase client that was the subject of pretty sophisticated fraud. Text messages, we've detected a transaction on your account, please call us. Of course, I never call. The person called, they got a call back purporting to be from JP Morgan Chase. The number comes up as JP Morgan Chase. The lady's out $180,000 before she knows it. That's her life savings. And JP Morgan Chase said, not our fault. And my post on this was, JP Morgan technically is correct. It's just not a good look. No. And at some point in time, I think security is going to become one of those assumptions that goes with the service contract, and because we're not going to teach hundreds of millions of consumers how to be security aware. So even though it may be their responsibility, I think a lot of that burden is going to be placed on the service provider to basically build inherently more secure systems and to make the service part of the product that they offer. I also think, quite frankly, when you think about this, I segment the marketplace. I think somewhere around Fortune 200, and it's on a sector by sector basis, you can assume that there is a relatively sophisticated defensive cyber operations capability in that organization. When you drop below that threshold, wherever it may be, you don't have the resource, you don't have the technical expertise. I actually think that security to that sub Fortune 200, and again, it's on a case by case basis, security is going to be provided by an MSP or an MSSP. And because that's where the expertise is, you're able to get critical scale, critical mass. And I think Forrest's world is going to embrace MSSPs, and insurance is going to be deployed as part of the product as MSSPs deploy their capabilities to their consumers.
Yeah, let's go to one of the questions, because I think that this fits in here. Brad Theodore is talking about appropriate permissions starting at zero trust as a starting point. And I totally agree with him. But I also noticed that Mint Mobile has been getting a whole lot of crap from customers because they actually enforce multi-factor authentication and using authenticator apps. So, and Brad's pointing out that small and medium businesses will deploy admin rights across all users for convenience. It may not be convenience. It just may mean they don't have the customer service people to handle the complaints from people that are putting that into policy. So what should we do? Should they go ahead and make sure it's zero trust even for users?
Yeah, and admin rights is one of the first things we always see when we go into a new customer, and especially small businesses, especially if that business doesn't have dedicated IT staff, where there's not a person. You might have the youngest person in the office who grew up with the technology is the one making decisions like this, and they're doing the best they can. And oftentimes those people are superheroes because they're running around like crazy, keeping the lights on for the organization in so many ways. There's just too much breadth of understanding to know where all the risks lie without a kind of objective outside look. And the admin permissions is a big one. And, you see things like, RDP enabled by default. I mean, we get to that kind of that concept of the secure baseline and understanding that, back to kind of where Bob and Forrest were going, there's this kind of integrated, like almost like, ante to get to the table from a cybersecurity hygiene standpoint. This is what you should do to push yes. Like to turn the machine on and say, yes, we're going live. There should be a minimum level of security integrated into those things. And we're dealing with a lot of legacy systems. We're dealing with a lot of, because we've always done this way. And again, that user experience component, even outside of that, the admin rights, the ability to install rogue softwares and, all of the different problems that come with that, just from a maintenance standpoint, that's a big one that you have to combat. And there's usually more of a cultural hurdle than a technical hurdle to overcome that one.
It is. And you're spot on in that, like, I think the overarching theme here from the question to what we're talking about is that the onus is on the business owner to really know their organization and to know where that they need to kind of really dive in. Is there kind of money that is possible to go out the window due to funds transfer fraud? Oftentimes the perception is that it's, maybe it's Dave in accounting that clicked on the cat video and that's how the money's going out. It's really not. We're really seeing it come from the CFO suite, someone in the treasurer group, where they don't have that second method of validating or verifying. And so they see the invoice come in and they know that probably 270 grand is about to go out, and they approve it. And just like that, it's gone. And so that's why we're seeing kind of the insurance companies also push down on the questions. But to the point about knowing your business, where it's useful is because sometimes these insurance applications aren't always connected to the real risk. And so they might ask, are you backing up your data? Well, you could be backing up your data and your backups are still infected, right? So what are you taking the measures to do it offline or doing a colo or making sure that there are certain things in place to
testing
where
your backups?
Exactly. To where if the issue is business interruption, then let's actually address business interruption exposure as opposed to just asking if you back up. And so it's really important to know your business and advocate for it.
Yeah, but part of that though, Forrest, is like we've been doing a lot with you guys and with Evan and others. The FTC pushed out the safeguards rule. They extended the timeline. It's now due now that it's June of this year for the safeguards rule. A lot of businesses don't even realize that they follow under that rule, but a lot of them are getting educated quickly that they do, right? So let's take a spectrum of businesses that are being heavily impacted by that FTC safeguards rule, which is the like automotive dealerships, right? So you made a comment of the business owners should know what their assets are, but they are focused on their core competency of how they run the business of how do I sell more vehicles today?
Right.
How do I sell more warranty plans or service plans today? That's their core competency. And then with technology, to be able to assist in focusing on that core competency, they expect this always on, always accessible mentality, like to do their core competency. And anything, as Evan goes back to say, that if you then make them use a 14-character password or then add a one-time passcode on top of the 14-character password and induce friction, right? That's moving drastically away from this always on, always accessible mentality. And their tolerance of they think it's more disruptive if you induce any interruption to that always accessible or always on mentality than the risk of possibly having a cyber incident, right? that's their mentality, and trying to bridge the gap between helping them learn, okay, we can use modern technology to reduce friction, but increase security and hopefully keep you always on, right? Mm-hmm. And it's then over the last 3 years with the pandemic, right, we had this massive shift to remote work from anywhere, even in places like dealerships, right? So people that didn't have to be on site weren't, and some of them aren't returning. So now you really had this accelerated move to the cloud. And Evan, you can probably speak to this, that where it went from perimeter base on-prem, especially at dealerships or like credit unions or places like that, where everyone was just on site and they could kind of use this, moat and firewall approach to security, to now you not only did you move your employees outside the perimeter, but they're now launching their own cloud SaaS apps, right? So, I need DocuSign, and they go get it, right, on their own. And you don't even know that they have it. So now, how are you, if you don't know what you don't have? So Forrest, to your point of, a lot of business owners may not even know that there's some applications in play that are at risk for them. And how do you help them lead into that discovery of understanding? You have to at least know what you've got first.
Yeah.
Well, or what to enable, right? Like if you have the ability to defend, then let's enable it.
Well, and what not to enable with, during COVID, we saw, a lot of IT professionals who all of a sudden, for the first time in their careers, had to manage a remote workforce.
RDP.
And they never had to do it before. They were ill-equipped. They'd never run through test scenarios. They didn't have the equipment. I mean, even prepared companies were scrambling. And
it's the most we've ever seen declinations in cyber insurance.
I think within like the first 6 months of everybody going home, we saw like a 475% increase in RDP attacks.
Yeah.
Because some IT guys just said, turn on RDP. We're going to use it everywhere because it's the only thing I've got. And it's all on, port 3389, and it's easy to scam from the outside. They're poking big holes in everything. They're on unsecured Wi-Fi at home. And you just saw this massive RDP takedown, and of course that's where they were going to go, So how you manage remotely with remote management monitoring tools that are secure and have good supply chain components, and the vendors you decide to bring in to secure that can be, is one of the most important decisions you can make. And how do you?
Okay, I'm going to break in here because we got a question from the audience, and this is something I'd like to know also. Farley Duvall is asking Bob, what's your black box with regards to vetting process that makes a lead to cyber successful? And I'm going to tack on to that, because when I talk to small and medium businesses about cybersecurity, it's not that they don't want it. It's not that they don't want to make it as good as possible. They just don't know what they should do. And that comes down to what are the companies offering to these people? So what are you looking for in that kind of a company?
Well, I think there's a couple of thoughts here. Number one, core to our playbook, and I sort of telegraphed it earlier, and it's our backgrounds, right? We approach cyber from an offensive perspective. Virtually every threat that we deal with in the threat landscape at some level originates on the offensive side. And what you'll find is when innovation takes place on the offense, 4 to 6 years later, it's mainstream and affects everybody. So when we're looking at companies, frankly, I get as close to offense as I possibly can. We've built a lot of teams with ex-offensive operators, particularly out of places like the National Security Agency. We find that is an indicator of where the threats will be. And we build solutions to those threats, defensive countermeasures. We had a company we started 6.5 years ago called Dragos in the industrial control security space. And at the time we started that company, the conventional wisdom within the venture community is there is no industrial security market. And as I pointed out to my colleagues, there's probably 10 guys in the venture community that are my peers. I said, that is a historically accurate statement that is about to change. Yeah. And the question was, how can you be so certain? I said, study the offense. The offense will tell you where the puck is going to be, and too much of what we do in Cyber Day, again, reactive, even on the investment side, as opposed to understanding where will the puck be. And what we tried to do is identify where the puck will be, and then to identify teams that have the expertise to develop, effective countermeasures. I remember when we started Dragos with Rob Lee and his two co-founders, they said, "What do we want to do?" I said, "Your job is to apply your knowledge and your expertise to identifying and stopping sneaky bastards like yourself."
Yep.
That's the job. And so leverage the offensive expertise to develop defensive countermeasures. So that's a real big part of how we approach the marketplace. We also, frankly, look for teams that have spent their entire career in cyber. Cyber is a lot like life sciences. It's not a pickup game. It moves too fast. It's too complex. You can't learn on the job and be competitive. And so, for us, it's that intersection of deep domain expertise with an offensive orientation to build defensive countermeasures. Guys on the offense know where the attackers are. They know where the vulnerabilities are. They know how the attacker is going to come at them. Yeah. So they're in the best position to develop, the defensive responses. I think, Lou, your point about, folks that want to be cyber secure and don't know how to get there. This is where I go back to, you can't expect everyone to, look, if you're a small business, you are outgunned and outmatched against an adversary. You just are. Mm-hmm. And so let's not pretend, I'm going to say, go find a managed security provider or go find an MSP or an MSSP and turn it over to them. And let them aggregate you and 10,000 businesses like you to achieve critical mass to build effective countermeasures. Be careful in the vetting process. But I think that is, when you look at the SMB space, up to the lower end of the Fortune 500, it's going to be managed security service providers that are going to be your partner in meeting those challenges, because you're not going to be able to do it on your own. You are outgunned and you are outmatched. There was one other thought that came up when we were talking there about, when we went remote, right? All of a sudden the entire enterprise moved outside of the secure perimeter. And what it reminded me of is sort of the fallacy of the Maginot Line in France. That all worked really, really well until you had mobile aircraft, right? And then all of a sudden they just went around your fixed fortifications. And so you're dealing with an undefined perimeter. Mm-hmm. And when you enter the world of IoT, put it on steroids.
Exactly.
And that leads to all sorts of technical challenges I'm going to talk to Forrest about later.
So that kind of sounds like that. There's no way you cannot be completely proactive, because the adversaries are out there doing things more and more differently all the time. So you're going to get caught, no matter how proactive you are. The proactivity is just going to lessen the possibility. So does it mean that we have to be both proactive and reactive in our defenses?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I know we had a comment where we were asked kind of how you educate people on that. And we talk a lot at GuideStar about what we call mission critical controls. And it's sort of this idea that there's an overlap of what insurance companies really want from you to get your liability coverage that you need, what hackers are doing, so that offensive, what's going on in the offense that Bob spoke about, and then also the regulation piece that Heath got to, and there's an overlap there. And those mission critical controls are the things you put in place that sort of help to align you with all of those parts for your business. And it's the basics. It's having a robust MFA. It's having a monitoring. It's having a modern antivirus, MDR, EDR, XDR component. It's the basic tool set that someone has to manage for you. Cybersecurity awareness training for your people, right? I can patch systems all day. I can't patch people. You've got to have your people tested and trained. All those are kind of the basics. And then you're right. There is no real proactive approach that's going to protect you forever. But the more proactive you are in your planning, the lower the impact will be. All the way down to having, how many internal teams are even aware of what the forensics tool sets they're going to be, or what they're going to have to do from an evidence handling standpoint. And it's not that you're going to be doing that yourself, because in most cases you're not. You're going to bring in folks that the insurance companies can bring to bear. You're going to bring in other third parties. But knowing what not to do, don't just shut the machine down and hit it with a hammer. You need to preserve that evidence. And making sure that your disaster recoveries and business continuity programs talk about those things and drill on those things, so your IT people and your business people are aware of it, is how you can sort of be proactive about being reactive.
And that's a really good point, Evan, because like in my world, we see a lot, like there's a kind of cultural, let's just call them cultural differences between the IT suite and then the finance suite within an organization. And so really what we help try to do is really be that translator that says, okay, let's actually all sit around the table, because the insurance company is making recommendations to a risk manager that then passes them on to the IT provider or the IT manager, who then passes them on to their MSP or MSSP about these are requirements that are being pushed down. Well, oftentimes the MSP has been recommending those solutions for the past 4 years, right? And then it's never made its way to that side of the house. And I think where we can really bridge that gap is adding that kind of risk premium to the conversation of saying, okay, this is why both of these teams need to have a seat at the table. This is why it looks in real practice of what an adversary, kind of to Bob's point, it might be that you're maybe a $300 million manufacturer, right? And it's not the network outage that you think it's going to be, because being down means that you're always online machinery. The oil gaskets are going to dry up when oil isn't lubricating the gaskets, right? And so the attack methods are kind of at large. It really is kind of fascinating, because if you think about it, as your surface area expands, your perimeter of the unknown or the risk and what you're ignorant of kind of expands even faster. And so how do you keep up with that is by working closely with those that know, which is the MSP, MSSPs, and those that can help kind of give you those best practices and guidance.
I think there's another interesting concept here. If you and I think it's all part of kind of cyber coming of age as we transition from being reactive to proactive. There's a concept called continuous controls monitoring that was really kind of developed by Phil Venables when he was the CISO at Goldman Sachs, and he's now over in that role over at Google. But when you look at the vast majority of security breaches, if you do root cause analysis, there's a failure of controls. And this problem gets to be very complicated. If you're in a large organization, you may have 75, 100, 125 products, which leads to, in the hope of getting better coverage, it actually leads to complexity, which actually makes you less secure at the end of the day. And the concept behind continuous controls monitoring is let's take all of the tools, let's integrate them and get a holistic integrated view of our security posture, so we understand where are we overcovered, where are we undercovered, how do we prioritize. And I think when you look at that, that 400, that Fortune 200 up to Fortune 1, I think you're going to see this as a significant direction in terms of how companies, monitor and manage their security posture. And I think, the new SEC rules coming out, really putting a lot of pressure on boards. Boards are going to be demanding that capability because they need a set of tools that give them the visibility, allow them to monitor, allow them to track progress, and report on their status. And when board members are now liable for how they oversee this job, much like boards are responsible for for financial audits, we're going to develop a whole new set of tools to get a lot better at understanding what our holistic cyber posture is, by which to make decisions and to manage and to allocate resources. And
the boards want their organization to be less fragile. That's the whole kind of intent behind it, is because the organizations can kind of, become more breakable when this is exposed. And so it's a great point, Bob.
And I think what you said, Forrest, about the collaboration between the insurance company and finance and IT and the MSPs, really, for a long time, risk in cyber was a 4-letter word. It was IT's dirty little secret that we just had to deal with and nobody else was going to touch. And the way that, the other proactive way we can do this is we have to be collaborative as security professionals. We have to have folks like Heath talking to folks like Bob and Forrest and I talking with companies. And it speaks to the supply chain risk, because even if you're running a great program, somebody in your supply chain's not, but that can affect you just as bad. So that you can bet that the hackers are sharing information. The bad guys are teaching each other how to do this to us, and we can't be afraid to ask for help talk about cyber risk, reach out, promote it.
Better
And
together.
I think that's what the SEC is trying to get to with putting this at the board level from the responsibility is this has to stop being IT's four-letter word of risk and move on to something that's just on the table as a normal business.
Boy, Evan, you're right on the money there, because look, IT is not the problem. IT is the vector.
Right.
This is about enterprise risk.
Mm-hmm.
And the more digital our enterprises are, the more we are susceptible to that vector being exploited.
Yep.
And so it's not an IT problem; it's an enterprise risk problem. And I think the SEC's guidance is making that more aware. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, we're going to go to a question from where is she here? From Larissa Grielska. And I think it wraps into some of the things we're saying here. She's saying that so many projects that are important for security teams die at the financial parties. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about on the board level about what their responsibility for. And there was another question that came up before that said, and maybe this wraps it all up, is that what's the minimum that they should be considering when they're trying to put in a proactive system? That was a good question,
really
huh?
Talk about it because like everything else, I'll be the true politician, and it depends, But from a minimum standpoint, you've got to identify what that secure baseline is for your systems, and make sure that you have that. You've got to understand your use cases, where your risk lies. So it starts with talking about tool sets first is not how you get there. You have to talk about tactics and then people to do it for you first, and then tool sets come in at the end. And so I think that's why partnerships between MSPs and MSSPs like us and teams with like Keith or with Heath really help bridge that gap, because we're going to come in with a tool set with a solution base that's going to create that minimum for you. And we're going to have really intelligent conversations about your business, and look through that kind of classic business impact analysis that anyone's ever taken a course on cybersecurity hears about, and look at the financial impact of your systems, what's important for you to protect and how you're going to protect those things, and just make sure that you can sleep at night knowing that you're doing as much as you can with the resources you have, and you're not just saying no because it costs money, or you're not just saying no because you don't want a 14-character password.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good softball for Heath.
Yeah, I mean, minimum. I mean, both Forrest and Evan can talk about, what's a baseline of controls, and what we're seeing. There's multiple market forces at play that are really finally, and I think kind of the pandemic kind of spearheaded making this a recognition. But in 2021, the top big players got called to what I like to joke about as the principal's office. And, we're called into the White House and said, what are you going to do about this cybersecurity problem we've got? Where are you investing? So one of the market forces we're seeing now is the big players are having to evaluate their supply chain and risk. And you're seeing mandates and security postures come out of, if you want to be a distributor or a service provider to one of the bigger companies, you're going to have to meet a certain posture, right? That framework of that posture typically includes a baseline set of controls. The Forrest and Evan will talk about, here's your top 6 controls to put in place. And Bob mentioned it's down to controls or lack of controls or implementation of those controls. Luckily for us, MFA is the table stakes today in one of those baseline controls of somewhere to start. I mean, Ann Johnson, corporate vice president at Microsoft for cybersecurity, speaks daily about, if you could actually implement strong MFA, and Jen Easterly at CISA frames it now as the gold standard is getting to phishing resistant MFA, would reduce your attack vector for identity-based attacks by 99%, getting that control in place, right? And so, that's a baseline. But the other market forces that we're seeing, and why this is so relevant for Forrest and Evan, and insurance, right? Everyone typically understands you got to have insurance, or, going back to that supply chain mandate, they might mandate that you have some level of cyber insurance. Well, to get cyber insurance, you're going to have to get these controls in place.
Yep.
And then
Okay. Hang on, folks, because we got to wrap this up. Let's have a lightning round here. 10 seconds each. What can we all do better?
I will say the minimums are increasing, the standards there, and so to know your business and advocate for your job function is my best advice.
All right, Evan.
I would say that communicating with, like we talked about before, and collaborating on cybersecurity is probably the most important thing as a business leader you need to be doing, and that working with MSPs and teams and your IT department, your finance, to create real goals and objectives for your cybersecurity program, and then holding them accountable to that.
Okay, Bob.
I would say prioritize cybersecurity. You could do everything else right in running your business. Cybersecurity is your Achilles heel. The more digital you are, the more exposed you are. But also be very pragmatic about the limitations on your capabilities. If you're Fortune 200, you can go it alone. If you're smaller than Fortune 200, go find a good MSSP.
All right, finally, Heath.
Yeah, take ownership. Recognize that the digital world, the more connected you are to the internet, the more risk you carry, as Bob just mentioned, and that you can't just stick your head in the sand. That you got to recognize that it will impact your core competency of running your business in the real world, and you got to take ownership of that, and realize that you may need to make some changes and invest the time to learn about what's happening in the digital world. There's enough headlines every day that you should be aware.
Okay, thanks to our audience for tuning in today, and to our panelists for a great discussion. If you have further questions for me or for any of our guests, you'll see our LinkedIn profiles below. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and have a great rest of the day wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you next on the next Ready, Set, Cyber. Well, that was fun.